Presentation. Apologies to everyone for getting us into the position where we've done this rather novel combination of two sections online. That's largely because of my problems in managing my diary to get around all the sections during the year of my presidency. So thank you for finding the time to join this lunchtime. I'm going to plough straight into what I grandly call the President's Address. I've produced this to enable me to articulate for all of you what I've been seeking to do as president. Could you move to the next slide, please? So what I'm going to talk about today is exactly that, what I'm seeking to do as president, what I've been seeking to do as president. I want to explain to you where I believe the PWI is, where it finds itself in 2023. I'll then pick up and talk about the strengths of the PWI and how we use those strengths to build the PWI into the future. And finally, I'll outline the objectives that I set for myself in July last year. Next slide, please. So in 2023, we are now part of the PWI, an organisation which has gone through some very hard work over the last 10 years. It has transformed itself in those 10 years. To stand back and reflect on a few things, we're now an Engineering Council registered professional engineering institution. That places us on the same platform as the ICE, the IET, the IMechE and the other big organisations. We're not a big organisation. We don't have the huge numbers of members that those bigger organisations have, but we have the same clout in the professional engineering institution world. The PWI is now financially sound and very professionally managed. When David Packer took over the role of chief executive about 11 years ago now, he was given two options to use his chief executive role. Option one was to turn the organisation around and make it viable into the future. Option two was stark. It was, if you can't do that, wind the organisation up. Well, David's time as CEO saw us set along a path that has brought us to the very strong position we find ourselves in now. We have good financial position and the management of the organisation is very professional. That good financial position can best be summed up by understanding that our revenue turned £1 million last year. That's a big change. So we now find ourselves having three, what I regard as unique selling points. We are the only professional institution which specialises in rail infrastructure. The IMechE have a railway division, but that's actually largely about trains and rolling stock. The civils, obviously, deal with civil engineering, but they don't have the specialism in track and rail infrastructure that is our turf. We have a superb professional registration organisation. Liz Turner and her team run the most supportive of the institution's professional registration functions. In the PWI, you get to speak to a human being, you get guidance and support. In the other bigger organisations, you get access to a website and forms to fill in. Our professional registration is second to none. It's a real strength. And we also have an excellent training and education facility under Brian Counter, the technical director. We deliver training and education in a way which is absolutely focused on railway infrastructure. Those are our strengths. Next slide, please. So how do we build on those strengths? Well, one thing we need is new members. We need new members just to stand still. The age profile of our membership is beginning to come down, which is a really good thing, because a lot of the members were a bit like me, really, grey-haired and retired. We need, for the future of the organisation, to keep recruiting people, younger people, into the organisation, into membership. That is doubly true if we want to grow our capability. I am really keen on making sure that our membership services, both to corporates and to individual members, are as good as we can get them. After all, it's the service we provide to people that is the encouragement for them to be members of our institution. The new members need a reason to join. They need a reason to join the PWI because they pay fees, and so they need to know what they're getting back. Our unique selling points are key to that reason. We need to be very clear that we're offering focused support to railway infrastructure people. And that support is about understanding railway infrastructure better, being educated in infrastructure better, and gaining the professional registration appropriate to their job in railway infrastructure. So we build on those strengths. Next slide, please, Sarah. We also want to broaden our scope in there. As you will all be aware by now, we've already set off and made great progress in attracting people from my discipline, from electrification. Well, that's great, and the progress has been fantastic, and I'm very proud of what we've done, for instance, in creating the electrification diploma. That is beginning to see electrification engineers coming through, taking the education and training and achieving professional registration. But when I speak to people, when I've spoken to people about electrification around the country and about joining the PWI, there are two responses, two questions that come back to me with tedious regularity. What are you doing, Peter Dearman, as president of a track organisation? And why do I want to join a track organisation? I'm an electrification engineer. And those questions are a direct result of the name of the institution. Now, it's interesting that our founders in 1884 wrote a scope of our organisation, wrote the articles of starting the organisation up. In there, it's very clear that we're interested in everything between the fence lines. Now, my view is that everything between the fence lines certainly includes all the infrastructure, and I say rather provocatively that we generally try and keep the trains within the fence lines, so it's everything railway that we're interested in. Next slide, please. So that brings me to be able to articulate what my objectives have been across this year. So the first is to continue to support the executive with that growth of the organisation, which enhances and consolidates all the offerings to our members. And I think that's really important to us all. I've sought and still seek to place the PWI as an organisation engaged across the engineering disciplines in rail infrastructure. That's really important. I don't shy away from talking about any part of the infrastructure across all of the disciplines, including signalling, electrification, plant, all the kit that goes to make up the system of the railway. I seek and have sought to be a visible ambassador of this institution within the industry and wider across engineering and into government. And that's something that I'm never shy to mention the fact that I'm president of the PWI in meetings with others. And I finally strongly promote active and purposeful debate towards changing the name of this institution. We need to move on, in my view, from the inevitable link of the name of the organisation suggesting we're interested in track only. There have been lots of different debates around the country as I've gone round. I've had a few people who have some reservations about making the change talk to me. I've had an even smaller number actually aggressively, semi-aggressively say the change is not right, we mustn't do it. But overwhelmingly, I have heard from people who are broadly supportive of making the change in a controlled and structured way. And you all perhaps are aware of the consultation on the strategy plan for the next 5 years, which has included that issue. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presidential address. And if there are any questions that have come up, looking at the time, we have got time to take any quick questions if there are any. Otherwise, I will move on to the second presentation, and we can take all questions at the end.
I think, yeah, there's no questions in the chat just yet, so let's just address them all at the end, if that's okay with you, Peter.
Yes, of course. Let's plough on, and hopefully we'll get through everything in time. Sarah, could you get number 2 up? Thank you. Okay, so securing the case for electrification now is what I wanted to actually just talk through with you today. So, Sarah, could we go to slide 1, 2, whichever that is? So, what am I going to talk to you about? I'm going to talk to you about the case for electrification. I'm going to talk to you a bit about a tremendously unengaging subject, economics, but we need to talk about that a bit. I will talk about some engineering issues and the role of engineers, which applies to engineers as a whole, not just in electrification. But first, I want to set the scene for this by outlining what I see as some of the challenges across the rest of this century, really. Sarah, please, next slide. Thank you. Well, in talking about the challenges, you get involved in thinking through the big issues. And we've come out of the COVID pandemic, and that wasn't a pleasant experience. And it's kind of changed a lot of things in a lot of ways. Fortunately, the pandemic has been declared to be over, but the aftermath of it is far from over. There's climate change with flood, fires and extreme temperatures. That's a big challenge. We've seen in the past year Russia's terrible invasion of Ukraine and the effect that's had on energy across Europe particularly. And the energy crisis as that's become is a serious issue. And overall, that really, all of those things bring about big challenges to our economic forecasts, and actually they spell austerity. And so money is going to be scarce. Next slide, please. I'm going to unpick those one bit at a time. Climate crisis, it's the here and now. We are seeing the effects of climate change actually as we speak. The air temperatures in the UK are trending upwards. Summer last year was a particular case in point. I really don't enjoy the heat, so I'm hoping we're not going to have 40 degrees again this summer. And that's just a selfish thing about being too hot. But the temperatures and the drier climate in the summer we're seeing is a serious issue. National governments, including ours, have committed to net zero. In the UK, that's a legal commitment. It's the law. We will be breaking the law as a nation if we're not at net zero by 2050. Next slide, please. That brings the need for us in rail to think very carefully about resilience. Those three little pictures on there show you the effect of rain on the left. That's Carmont, the disaster in Scotland. Wind in the middle is a section of line near Coventry, where the wind caused a dewirement, and the heat causes track buckles. And there's a fantastic picture of a typical track buckle on the screen there. Next slide, please. I talked about the fragility of our energy system. That war in Ukraine is dreadful in its own right, and I don't want to get involved in that too much, but it has thrown a spotlight on our dependence on Russian gas. Last winter, we got through without too much apparent impact on our daily lives other than the price of the energy we use. In point of fact, our gas reserves were down to zero, and had we had a cold snap in February, we would have been having power cuts and even gas shut off to our homes. We were close to that position, but didn't quite make it. Germany did. The economic effects of all that are obvious to us all. We're all paying more for our domestic energy, and our industry is paying more for the bulk energy that we use for traction and other things. And it's interesting that just when decarbonisation is needed, what did it provoke our dear government to do? They gave more money to the oil industry and the coal industry to open a new coal mine and start exploration for more oil. In a time when we're supposed to be stopping exploiting fossil fuels, our government has turned to fossil fuels to address the energy crisis. I'm not personally that happy about that. Next slide, please. I think it's as well to just dwell upon the remarks from these two influential people in climate and decarbonisation considerations. Greta Thunberg's message, the message is clear. Words are not enough. The people demand climate action now. David Attenborough said, "How could I look my grandchildren in the eye and say I knew what was happening to the world and did nothing?" That's a pretty powerful quote. There are still some people who deny that climate change is man-made, but they're really marginalised, and that's becoming, in my view, rightly seen as parallel with the Flat Earth Society's view of the world. Attitudes have changed. People generally are appreciating that the climate crisis is really something we have to react to. Now, transport must decarbonise, and rail has a position as the cleanest form of land transport. Rail surely ought to be working to leverage off that and get the impact of road traffic reduced. You can't ignore these two quotes, I think. So I'm going to go on to ask what we should do as an industry, and particularly in the UK. Next slide, please. So what part can the railway play? What can we do to decarbonise traction? What should we focus our research on? And what are the priority objectives? Where should we spend our money? That's what I want to go on and develop an argument for. Next slide, please. So let's ask ourselves about some of the more high-profile publicity issues that are debated quite often. Hydrogen is often put forward as an answer to powering self-propelled trains in the future and avoid all that costly and horrible electrification work. Well, hydrogen is actually a very inefficient energy vector. You don't mine hydrogen, it doesn't exist in free form on the planet. If it's generated by chemical reactions, it dissipates into the atmosphere. There is no hydrogen mine that you can go to. You have to make hydrogen. The making of the hydrogen involves embedding energy, if you like, into producing that gas. Producing it is quite costly in energy terms. For every watt of power that you want to use at the train, in the case of this picture, it costs you 5 watts to make the hydrogen in the first place. So its energy efficiency is below 20%. It's not a viable option for rail before 2010, in my view, before 2100, sorry, before the end of this century, in my view. You have to have green energy generation at a capacity, a secure capacity, which enables you to make the hydrogen in the first place. And our progress towards green energy generation solutions won't peak until about 2090. So it's only viable at 2100, if then, for rail, in my opinion. Next slide, please. So are batteries the solution? Well, there's been lots of development work on batteries, isn't there? And there's quite a few, no, there's more than quite a few. There's a lot of battery-powered vehicles on the roads now. But that technology is still evolving. And the charging capacity on the roads is proof enough of how difficult it is to get batteries to work. But underlying all of that, there are some controversial environmental impacts of digging up the rare earth metals that make the batteries. And the clue is in the name as to why rare earth metals are a finite resource. If we're going to be making many millions of batteries for all sorts of reasons, does the earth have the capacity to provide them to us? And have we got the mining of those minerals in a defendable position? There are some awful stories about the environmental and sociological effects on the countries where those minerals are mined. The batteries are probably good for bridging gaps in electric train routes as we seek to roll out electrification, and for some small branch lines. But batteries will not do heavy haul freight, in other words, or high speed trains. It's just not, they're just not capable of storing the energy sufficiently to do that. Next slide, please. So we're left with full electrification. Full electrification is the most efficient use of electrical generating capacity. There's about 3% lost in the transmission between the power station and the train. If the generation is zero carbon, the traction is zero carbon. There's nothing generating carbon between the generator and the train moving. It is the only option for fast passenger or heavy haul freight. Look at Europe. Heavy haul freight, fast passenger is all electric. It's an established technology. There's no need to develop anything. Any research and development is about improving and refining and reducing the cost of the system. Next slide, please. So the answer is, in my opinion, to electrify. So I'm going to now consider whether in the UK we can make electrification happen. I'm asking that question there, can we confidently predict that an electrified railway will take its proper place in the decarbonised economy? Next slide, please. No, is the answer. Unless we change radically and fundamentally the way we deliver electrification in the UK, the answer is emphatically no. I've been into the Treasury, into the DfT and around political circles, and there is absolutely no confidence that we can do it that we're anywhere near being able to address the cost of electrification. And that cost is too great. It's not marginally too great, it is substantially too great. Our economy in the UK is under huge stress presently. Inflation is still growing as the government and the Treasury try to wrestle with wage costs and all the costs that come in. There isn't money for investment, and rail investment is not at the front of the queue anyway. And I think we would all reflect that we don't particularly want it to be. We want our health service to be invested in properly. We'll all have our own view on the priorities, but I'm not sure there's many people would argue rail is at the front of the queue. The last control period, CP5, was a calamity from this perspective. In terms of electrification, what was delivered in CP5 was okay. Great Western as an electric railway is fantastic compared to what the diesel railway was. Northwest electrification has made a great difference to Northwest passengers. But how it was delivered wasn't even acceptable. It was just nonsensical. What we proved is that electrification is unaffordable. Next slide, please. So here we go, the economics. Did warn you I was going to talk about this. The economic analysis of rail schemes continues to value journey time improvement above all else. Electrification on its own really only marginally improves journey times, because unless you're improving the line speed at the same time, the only benefit you're getting is the better acceleration from the electric trains. BR constructed business cases to include the fleet benefits. In other words, if there was a diesel depot that closed because of the change in fleet, the savings from the diesel depot were included in the electrification case. The lower attrition to the infrastructure isn't included in modern evaluations. Track lasts longer on electric railways than it does on diesel railways. None of that has been included since privatisation. The modal shift is not valued. So where we're seeking to improve train routes such that more freight can run, more passengers are taken, the modal shift from road to rail, from air to rail, is not valued in today's evaluation. That particularly damages the case for electrification of freight routes. There's no valuation of carbon agreed. No two people in positions of expertise can agree what saving a tonne of carbon is actually worth. And there's no value at all ascribed to eliminating particulate emissions. Think of city centres who are almost universally around the country considering what to do about diesel traffic on the roads. Well, there are often railways with diesel trains running into those cities as well. Where's the value of the particulate emission? Without valuation of pollution, we continue to give fossil fuel an advantage in the business case evaluation, and that's a shame. the case for electrification is undermined by those economic rules. Next slide, please. The next thing to understand, which we've kind of lost the thread of over the last 30 years, is that electrification of a route is a production task. A unit of overhead line is a wire run, about a mile long on one track is a wire run between the balance weights or the tension anchors. Other than complex junctions or station areas, each and every wire run is essentially the same. And that's a classic production engineering activity. And that's how we used to do it, as a production activity. A production engineer is driven by reducing cost and maximising efficiency. A project manager is driven by a plan and an end date. The clash of intent has to be sorted out. On Great Western, I watched in consternation as artificial end dates drove an at any cost approach to meeting that end date. A preposterous situation, really, where you've got bi-mode trains. The end date really doesn't matter. It's the cost of getting to the end date that matters. Much in electrification delivery is mismanaged by project management. So next slide, please. But how do we turn no into yes? Well, let's understand a few facts first. Network Rail is the most expensive railway in Europe for capital works, probably in the world. There are major issues about project management and contractual frameworks in there that drive the cost upwards. We have a predilection for doing the safety case for every job new every time we do it, which puts lots and lots of cost into doing each job in turn. There are major issues about access time to achieve a production environment for the build. I don't actually think that's an easy one to resolve, but it is one that has to be resolved. As a couple of facts, we are much more expensive than Germany and Denmark, those well-known low-cost environments for implementing work. Our costs are higher than Switzerland, that well-known cheap economy. Unchanged, the inertia of the network rail culture will prevent any move away from the behaviours that cause the cost issues that are driving costs up. And that inertia will prevent no from changing to yes. Next slide, please. So what's the role of the engineer? Well, I was mentored by a gentleman by the name of Alan Goldfinch. He was the Chief Mechanical and Electrical Engineer of Eastern Region. He mentored many people, me included. He described an engineer in three ways. It's a bloke who can do for 10 bob what any idiot can do for £1. He told me that an engineer knows the boundaries of his own knowledge, and issues within those boundaries may well be debated with peers, but are confidently and, if necessarily, robustly stated to those who are not engineers. And an engineer is confident enough to say no and articulate clearly and with authority why he's saying it. To my mind, some of that culture in engineering has been lost over the past 30 years in rail. Next slide, please. So what must us engineers do if we're going to make electrification and indeed other investment work in the UK better? Well, as individuals and as a profession, we must look for and champion the 50p solution and understand that the £1 solution is lazy and bad. We must look beyond the boundaries of our own knowledge, and with peers and more experienced people, we must debate things that are outside our direct levels of experience so that we can start to influence rather than just administer. And that's a really important question. Nobody knows all the answers, but you do know the questions to ask and you know people to talk to. So as engineers, think about this. Do you end up a lot of your time in administrating and off-pat engineering solutions, or are you truly empowered to innovate and do what's needed to get the job more efficient and better? You can answer that question for yourself. Importantly, we have to work together with the project managers, project directors, and indeed managers and directors in the direct line in the client organisation. The perceived dominance of project managers and directors is an illusion. They can't reach solutions without proper engineering. And actually CP5 proved the folly of overly powerful project management teams. Next slide, please. Late BR electrification schemes were outstanding in many respects, I realise in retrospect. Those late schemes in Anglia, Ayrshire Coast and the ECML particularly were the envy of the world. I remember taking a group of SNCF engineers around York back in 1991, and the French couldn't believe what we'd achieved at the cost we'd delivered it rather. I am hugely proud of what we did with ECML. The project director, Don Heath, published his completion certificate with those words in red in big print across the front page, 1 year early and under budget. I've often had people tell me since privatisation, in a rather stinging and critical way, that the ECML was delivered on the cheap. In later years, my reaction to anyone who says that to me is to say, listen, friend, in the modern world, you've tried during CP5 the alternative. You tried it on GWET, NWET, Egypt and GOB. all of those schemes were late and overspent. Was that better for you? Don't think so. Next slide, please. So what must the whole organisation do? The whole organisation is probably not a good way of expressing this. What I'm saying is the whole industry, right from DFT downwards. From the top down, there has to be a culture of change. And I don't see enough top-down pressure to contain the cost of big scheme implementation. I see all sorts of pressures about OPEX costs, but I'm not seeing the same levels of pressure in reducing the cost of capital investment through contractor engagement. I particularly am critical of the really soft and forgiving approach to benchmarking of costs. In the UK, future projects are benchmarked against the mean costs of CP5 projects in the UK. That can't be right. The challenge is to benchmark against the best in class, not against the worst. A single track kilometre of electrification is deliverable at circa £1 million. At present, NR are seeing 2 million as good and tolerating 2.5. Next slide, please. In summary, from what I'm saying, 25 kV overhead electrification is the technology to deliver our response to climate change for UK rail and, importantly, for the wider transport infrastructure. We will achieve a modal shift of freight if we manage this properly. We will achieve a modal shift from the roads out of cars and particularly out of planes if we manage this properly. Rail electrification can be delivered economically. What stops us from achieving that in the UK are a UK problem. Whilst engineering can be simplified, it's not engineering that's the fundamental problem. The problem is the way that we contract and commercially manage delivery of these big schemes. Look at HS2, look at Crossrail, look at what was the West Coast Route modernisation and its history, and you will see that our model is flawed. So we need leadership and relentless pursuit of the goals. And that is the missing ingredient. Next slide, please. And so in closing what I'm saying today, we can turn no to yes. Once upon a time, UK led the world, and we can do that again. Future electrification relies upon applying the lessons, those lessons from the past, and applying them in a modern context. That requires a fundamental change in the implementation model. The new implementation model, based on the late BR way of working, recognising that electrification is a production activity, is where we need to head. Or to put that another way, last slide, please. We need to go back to the future. And that's it. That's me finished. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Peter. Got it in perfect time, I'd say. We normally like to leave 15 minutes for questions. So if you do have any questions, if we could put them in the chat. There's a few questions that have been
already, isn't there? Yeah.
Dropped in. I think just during the break, Stuart Corrie mentioned railway infrastructure and systems engineers RISE. Yeah, it's going for the acronym, like it. Okay, so Warren, who I think might be on the beach. Are we looking to expand the organisation to include M&E, electrical, etc., telecommunications with the new PWI title? Makes sense to change the systems.
Yes, indeed. As I say, my objective in the strategy debate with the PWI is to expand our offering to anyone working in railway infrastructure, and those M&E electrical people are included in that great net of catching everybody. Yes, yes, indeed.
Okay, good stuff. Warren again, obviously, nice and relaxed today. So OLE will never be cheap if we're constantly using new systems incomplete before design, construction starts, multipass design, construction killed, GWRM and NWE with new systems series 1 and series 2. So I think that's more of a statement than a question.
Well, it is a statement, and it's a statement of fact, and I fully agree with that. And the whole purpose of moving forward, which Phil Doughty, the CM&E of Network Rail, has taken forward, is to produce the the UKMS, the Master Series of overhead line for Network Rail. There should now be no need to develop any further new systems into the future. The UKMS range needs to be understood to be the UK overhead line system. I agree with the sentiment of the point. CP5 was flawed because there was a requirement to accelerate getting into building the new systems prior to the system development being in place.
Right. Okay. Very good. Robert Wilkins, planning should allow designs to be finished with a defined gap after grip pace 5 to allow contractors to properly plan cost and stage the design in the most efficient manner. Most of what we do now is guesswork to achieve an end date. Yeah, it's a good point.
And that is absolutely, Rob, hello, good afternoon, good to see you here. That is absolutely correct. I agree with what Rob has put in that point. And again, I come back to a link to something I've said. what is it that causes that acceleration into build commencing? It's what some project team have put on a project plan as a Gantt chart issue. And having an artificial date to start drives you down the path of starting, no matter how mature the design actually is. So again, back to my point, project management damages our ability to run this as a production activity. And I fully agree that the grip processes are part and parcel of the problem. I'm greatly encouraged by work on Midland Mainline 3, the electrification to Sheffield, where MML3 are moving to a new model which seeks to address exactly the point Rob is making there, get the design to maturity point where it's complete, and only then embark on build.
Yeah, it makes sense, really, doesn't it? You look at it like that. Okay, Stuart Curry, how to get those unpriced negative externalities included in other systems as well as our own?
I think what that's saying is that we are, I think perhaps what it's asking, we're vulnerable to other forces outside of our direct costs in rail, which cause inflationary pressures on the cost we pay, such as work on the national
modal
grid.
shift and and all these other things that have to go into these business cases. You put particulate matter, for example. It's not, you say that's not included in, a road scheme, but okay, well, how do we get it in there, and how do we get it into our own as well? Because business cases are also going to include a do nothing case, which will have costs in particulates, as an example.
Precisely. Yes. The only answer I can give you, what am I doing about it, is that I'm going and prodding people in the Treasury and in DFT about their economic evaluation processes, and seeking to get them to understand. I spent some time talking to Sir John Armitt at the weekend about how he can do something about that from the National Infrastructure Commission point of view, which he chairs, of course. It's about making the debate happen. Nothing in politics changes because you want it to. You have to lobby about it and you have to talk about it. And that's back to my point about giving PWI a voice in political circles, which is what I've been trying to do and will continue to do.
Interesting as well with the whole carbon argument. Again, something you don't consider when we're trying to show, obviously rail is very good for the environment in terms of pollution, etc. So something we never highlight, the equivalent miles so in as a car. So maybe that's something we should be
we should, and what included. We should do, what I have noticed, and I have slight reservations about, is that I see a lot of work on quantifying embedded carbon in the various solutions we use, particularly in track terms. People have talked about the steel and concrete sleeper issues, which are obvious ones for track. What we tend to do is beat ourselves up about the embedded carbon that we put into those, the build of that stuff. What we don't do is the benefits case of having done it for getting vehicles off the roads.
Yeah.
So we look at it as a victim thing. We look at it as costs to us. Therefore, that's a bad thing. We don't do the balancing bit about the benefits of having done it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, moving through, there's gathering some questions here. Andrew Dearman just put a tweet there yesterday about basically what you were saying. It's a bit small on my screen, but need to replace the diesel trains without the need for extensive and intrusive overhead lines. Okay, I'll have a word with him. Quiet.
Yep.
Alex Patterson, thinking of joining the PWI. I'm an OLE engineer and attended the OLE themed calls today and yesterday. Is the system getting professional registration similar to other institutions to cover OLE people, I guess?
Yes, yeah, all you need to do is on the PWI website under the registration thing, start your discussion with the registration team and they will help navigate you through all of that. And as I said, our registration process is people orientated. You get a person to speak to, not a message from a website.
Yeah. Greg Chapman, Lib Dem, we're Hob House.
I've quoted text from an MP, so debating the electrification on East West Rail. They want MPs are wanting it as well. So we've got tickets there to help levy and get electrification ticket on East West Rail.
Yeah, and I am actually personally speaking to East West Rail, strangely enough, next Tuesday about supporting their renewed, I have to say, and somewhat invigorated approach to trying to justify continuous electrification across the whole of the East West Rail corridor. At the moment, they've got a gap in the middle, which is, we won't go into that in too much detail, but it's a bit nonsensical to electrify one end and the other and leave a hole in the middle.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for that, Greg. And then Stuart Curry asking the question, should the ban on third rail electrification be removed?
Yes.
Final
Full
question.
Stop. Yes,
yeah,
it should. And 10 years ago, when times were different and money was in better supply, I was advocating that for the main lines south of the Thames, particularly the southwest route and the Brighton route particularly, that we should convert to AC traction. But my view has changed over the 10 years because the climate change and events have changed. We don't have the money that we're swilling about now to do that. There is absolutely no theological case against third rail electrification in my mind. There is a strong reason to get all trains hauled by electric power, be that third rail or overhead. So yes, the expansion of the third rail network to infill gaps is an imperative.
Very good. And then there was just a final comment there from Robert, just saying that he's got 3 engineers who give up with IMECI and looking at going through the PWI. So that's good news.
Yep. Brilliant.
Great. Well, Peter, thank you for that. Really interesting, quite hard hitting, good direct message. I love presentations like that. So thanks for that open and direct view. And yeah, I mean, and thanks for the questions. Some really good points raised there. Obviously, you'll get updates from your section bit Nottingham on the next talk. And we'll send out some information on the next Manchester section meeting. If we could all just do the usual reaction and give Peter a round of applause, that would be much appreciated. Peter.
Virtual applause, brilliant. Yeah.
Peter, thank you very much for that, and we look
You're
forward
welcome.
to seeing what more you achieve in the rest of your tenure.
And beyond.